Hello, everyone. My name is Anubhav Gupta. I'm the Associate Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and we're coming to you live here on Thursday, March 26th. This is the third in the Asia Society Policy Institute's web-only event series entitled Coronavirus, Asia, and the World. I hope this finds you all safe and healthy. I know these are troubling and stressful times, so thank you for joining us. Since this past week, here at the Asia Society, we've been presenting web-only programs every week to analyze the full scope of the ramifications from COVID-19 for the region and the world. We will be joined in a moment by Danny Russel, who will discuss the impact of the virus on China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. A quick note to our live audience. If you have any questions for our guest today, please comment on YouTube or Facebook, and we will get to as many of those as we can. As many of you know, the BRI is Chinese President Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy and economic policy initiative. It was launched in 2013 as an ambitious global infrastructure network that would aid regional connectivity and economic development, while also raising concerns that it would enhance China's influence around the world. Estimates indicate that the initiative encompasses a whopping $1 trillion in projects across over 125 countries. In some ways, nothing embodies the scope and ambition of China's rise as a global power as much as the BRI. As we've seen COVID-19 mutate into a global pandemic and spread across the world, it has left nothing untouched. The BRI is no different. Our discussion today will be about how the coronavirus has impacted BRI projects around the world and what it means for the initiative, which has faced criticism since its inception going forward. After all, this pandemic has highlighted that connectivity, despite its many benefits, can also at times make us more vulnerable. This is why we're lucky that our guest today is Daniel Russel, who was the senior Asia-Pacific diplomat in the US government as Xi Jinping took power and launched the Belt and Road Initiative. Danny is Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Before joining Asia Society, he was a longtime diplomat. Most recently, he served as US Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. And before that, Danny was Special Assistant to President Obama. Danny, I'll ask you to comment a little bit on today's topic.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Anubhav, and welcome to everybody who's participating in the webcast. I hope everybody's staying healthy. As Anubhav said, obviously this is a stressful time, and I'm in New York, an epicenter, but for all of you in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, I also want to start by saying a special thank you to the first responders and the healthcare professionals who are putting it on the line for all of us right now. So, Anubhav, you made some important points about the Belt and Road, about the coronavirus. And I think it's important to examine the effects each is having on the other, since they are so important in the developing world in particular. You mentioned connectivity. And so now what I think we need to look at is whether these thoroughfares for trade and for travel are also going to become pathways for pathogens as well.
Great. And obviously, many people are preoccupied with the public health dimensions of the crisis. Why is it important that we also start to think about things like the BRI? Why is it such a big deal?
Well, it's a big deal for a lot of countries and a lot of regions, as you mentioned. It spans five continents. It's over $1 trillion in really badly needed infrastructure. So, the Belt and Road is putting in place ports and roads and high-speed rails, transportation, power stations, dams, pipelines. It's connecting China with Southeast Asia, with Central Asia, South Asia, Eastern Europe, parts of Africa, so on. So it has a big impact on the world. It has a big impact on the host countries, some good, some not so good. And as you pointed out, it's also a very big deal for China. This is kind of the poster child for the China dream. This is Xi Jinping's signature international project. China's invested immense capital in Belt and Road, both literally financial capital, but also political capital. And it has geostrategic importance. You alluded to this also. It gives China access. And it gives China, frankly, leverage all over the world. And also because, frankly, it's doing what America isn't doing anymore. So the US in particular, but also Japan, India, others are increasingly finding it hard to compete in that context.
Great. And Danny, you co-wrote a report this past year entitled Navigating the Belt and Road Initiative, which offered recommendations on how China and partner countries could make BRI projects more beneficial and sustainable. The US and other countries like India have been consistently critical of the BRI. So before COVID-19, before this crisis really hit, plenty was already amiss. Tell us what kinds of problems BRI was running into.
Well, thanks for the plug, Bob. It's true. We looked at a range of problems in Belt and Road initiatives. We weren't looking for the problems, but the ones that we found fell into a couple of categories. First, many projects were just not commercially viable. And as a result, they had created or were creating very significant debt loads in low-income countries. So there's some of the middle-income countries like Malaysia or like low-income like Myanmar that managed to renegotiate the terms of the projects, but many other countries haven't been able to do that. We found a lot of environmental problems that serve really as ticking time bombs. And, some of those time bombs have detonated. So you get, a dam on the Mekong that is wiping out fish stocks downriver that millions of people depend on. And so on. We found in some cases some pretty severe social and political problems. So the villagers in Laos who were displaced to construct a high-speed rail, who were promised compensation but never got it. We see the political problems that flow from widespread corruption, which also entails a lot of price inflation and so on. We saw a lot of labor problems. Chinese contractors in many cases relied on imported workers from China. So the result is that a lot of the promised employment, the jobs weren't created, and workers, both Chinese and locals, were often exploited. So it takes some time for the extent of the problems to surface. China has begun over the last year to get a fair amount of pushback from many of these countries. Some of the projects have run into real problems and stalled out. I think China, to its credit, has tried very hard, and we saw this in the last international forum hosted in Beijing, has tried to make Belt and Road, greener and cleaner and more commercially sound. So they're definitely aware of, and in some cases grappling with those pre-coronavirus problems.
Okay, so let's bring that conversation then to the present moment. What has been the impact of coronavirus on the BRI so far? How have host countries reacted, and how are the projects processed and progressing now that we have shutdowns, curfews, and quarantines in places across many economies around the globe?
Yeah, the impact has been significant and virtually immediate. Quite a few BRI projects did grind to a halt when the virus hit China. Remember, this was the start of China's Lunar New Year's, its Spring Festival. Many employees, workers, managers, engineers went back home to China for the holidays and then got stuck there. They were unable to travel back, or they traveled back and they were quarantined, sometimes double quarantines. And you saw in some projects missed construction deadlines. Those created legal problems. They created financial problems for the local contractors, some of which went out of business. Many of the projects import upwards of 50% of their material and their machinery from China. And that equipment, that material got stuck when Chinese factories shut down and when transportation shut down. There are also a number of reports and incidents from not only Africa, but South Asia and Southeast Asia as well, where local workers refused to come back to the BRI project site with Chinese staff because they were afraid of getting the virus. They were afraid of the Chinese staff. They were worried about Belt and Road infection. So you had major projects, a rail project in Nigeria that was put on hold. Pakistani officials said that in the gigantic China-Pakistan economic corridor, sort of a $64 billion aggregate undertaking, a number of sites were shut down. You saw the same thing with the Jakarta-Bandung Railway and project in Indonesia. So it's been pretty widespread. Now, these effects may be temporary. And don't get me wrong, it's not like the host countries don't want the projects. They want projects, they want infrastructure. But it's not always so easy to reboot a big infrastructure project that has stalled out. And the delays thus far mean increased costs, missed deadlines, bankruptcies, labor problems, and so on. So there are considerable problems.
So we're in a situation where China already faced a lot of challenges with regards to BRI, and now individual projects, a lot of them can't continue, as if business as usual. So how is the Chinese government responding in terms of policy? Have they doubled down on BRI, or are they pulling back some of these projects?
Well, look, as I said, this is Xi Jinping's brand. This is the Chinese Communist Party's brand and their flagship initiative. They can't just walk away from BRI. But, stop and think about the coronavirus's impact on the Chinese economy. For one thing, the virus came on top of what has been an extended slowdown in China's growth. It came on top of the effects of the extended US-China trade war, which are considerable. And just the shutdown alone meant 2 months or so of lost productivity, manufacturing output, services. So, analysts, people who know a lot more about business and the economy than I do, are slashing their growth forecasts for China. And, we're really talking about the hit on the supply side, on the production side. There's also the cost of just dealing with the health crisis itself. But on top of that, there's the hit on the demand side, which is really just beginning, I think, to be felt, because you've got stores and factories shutting down in the US, Europe, around the world. So even if Chinese factories come back online, unless they're making masks and ventilators and so on, you got to ask who's buying products right now. So when it comes down to how China now is pursuing BRI, I guess I'd just make a couple of points. One, Chinese foreign investments last year were already way down, something like 40% from the previous year. So there were already some indicators of BRI investment overstretch. Second, the Chinese have been trying very hard, without much luck, to recruit foreign investors in Belt and Road projects, commercial banks, and so on. And if that was hard before, imagine how difficult it's going to be in the future. Thirdly, you began to hear over the last year or so Chinese citizens doing what middle classes just do, which is complain, like, hey, why are you pouring our hard-earned tax money down some foreign rat hole when you should be building X, Y, and Z in my community for me and my family? It's a very conventional public pushback. So you're not going to see a lot of enthusiasm among the Chinese people for building bridges in Croatia when people are hurting in Hubei province and elsewhere. They're hurting financially. They want hospitals. They want health care for themselves at home. So that points to the economic fallout that China is going to have to contend with. There's been immense damage to small and medium-sized businesses. That's got to be the Chinese government's top priority. And just speaking as somebody who has spent a career in government, I think it's reasonable to predict that it's going to divert a tremendous amount of financial resources, but also a lot of policy focus away from the Belt and Road back towards priority issues at home.
Sure. So China's facing significant policy challenges, but you also mentioned that the BRI is really a big chunk of the China brand internationally. So I wanted to, I've noticed that Beijing has really engaged in the past few weeks in a pretty active diplomatic and PR push to repair its reputation, given that its early mismanagement allowed the outbreak to spread out of Wuhan. So how much of that PR diplomatic campaign has been specifically about the BRI, and how much has it been targeted toward BRI host countries?
Well, initially what you saw was Chinese officials denying that there was any impact whatsoever from coronavirus on the BRI itself. Then that mutated into insistence that it's just going to be a temporary delay. And now you see the Belt and Road, to your question, I think really getting sort of folded into China's new coronavirus diplomacy. It's the new narrative. It's sort of face mask diplomacy. So I'd say it's a little of both. Now, in terms of the coronavirus diplomacy, the Chinese are handing out medical equipment with a great deal of fanfare. If you look at where they are concentrating that effort, you see a lot of overlap with Belt and Road countries because there really does seem to be some correlation between political accommodation by a foreign government and joining the BRI, whether or not there's a project or not, is an important signal of political accommodation in Beijing's eyes. So a correlation between that political status and the beneficiary of China's medical largesse right now. So you see Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. But you also see countries that have just been sort of rhetorically supportive of BRI, like Italy, on the receiving end of this, face mask diplomacy. In fact, I think Xi Jinping was talking to the Italian prime minister when he invoked the concept of the health Silk Road to go along with the digital Silk Road and the Arctic Silk Road and the maritime Silk Road and so on. But the point I would make is that when it comes to not only BRI, but it comes to global public health infrastructure, there is a lot more to it than just doling out, face masks and gowns and gloves and testing kits. And if the stories today coming out of the Czech Republic and Spain about the Chinese testing kits that don't work, if those stories are true, then they've really got problems. But beyond that, if the coronavirus were to hit, say, Africa or Southeast Asia or Central Asia or South Asia or Eastern Europe, with the force that it has hit Italy and Western Europe and the United States, the scale of the disaster is going to be monumental. Yeah. And so clearly it's going to require action from international leaders. But if you're going to build a hospital in a low-income country that's being devastated by coronavirus, hardware alone isn't going to cut it. A hospital is going to need electricity. It's going to need clean running water. It's going to need nurses. It's going to need doctors. It's going to need medical equipment. It's going to need medicine. It's going to need training. So there's a lot more to this than software. There's a lot more to it than hardware. There's the software. And there's a lot more to it than just slogans.
Sure. And before I turn to kind of the next steps, Danny, I just want to remind our audience that's watching live to, if you have a question for Danny, please post a comment on YouTube and Facebook, and we'll get to those in a couple of minutes. So Danny, what's your prediction for the road ahead? Will coronavirus severely hurt China's reputation, but also, the central logic of connectivity to the detriment of the BRI? Or do you think, there is a path forward where China and the host countries can at some point get back to business as usual and get these projects going again?
Well, as I think I indicated, the desire on the part of developing countries for infrastructure isn't going to dissipate, but the ability to actually pay for those infrastructure projects certainly is. Because remember, there aren't any Belt and Road projects in wealthy industrialized countries. The vast number of projects are in low-income countries, some in middle-income countries, but clearly BRI countries are those in which the public health systems are almost by definition going to be weaker than they are in places like, say, New York City, where I am, or in Milan, for example. And look at how badly the health systems in advanced Western countries have been hit. So number one, I'd say it's really a given that dealing with the coronavirus emergency is going to be an urgent priority for these BRI governments, the host governments, for the foreseeable future. So they are going to have their hands full. Second, that their own development priorities are going to change, and their own government budgets are going to shift along the lines of those priorities to healthcare, not to dams, not to bridges. The power plants are going to have to wait. Moreover, if it's hard enough for these developing countries to afford massive infrastructure projects as it is, imagine in the midst of not just a pandemic, but a global economic downturn that's universally predicted. To make matters worse, they're going to go into this global recession or whatever, owing immense sums of money from the existing projects, even if those projects aren't going anywhere, even if they're stalled. So, you look ahead at BRI and you see a massive debt burden in quite a few of the BRI countries as it is. So Laos, Cambodia, Mongolia, Zambia, Congo, and Africa, Pacific Islands, and so on. These are countries that have a debt owed to China that exceeds 20% of their GDP. That's kind of amazing. So where I come out is that it's just a given that despite wanting infrastructure and despite China's determination to carry high the banner of the party of Belt and Road, that the BRI projects themselves face some pretty strong headwinds, both in the project host countries, but also, as I said, in China.
Great. So, there's a lot of question marks then going forward, and I want to, plug your report once again. But in the report, you outline several steps that China and host nations could undergo to improve BRI projects on things like transparency, which you just mentioned, environmental standards, labor practices, and debt sustainability. However, host countries often, lack the diplomatic leverage, and often Beijing lacks the political incentive to change anything. Do you see the current crisis changing that dynamic in any way? And providing a window of sorts to make the kinds of improvements you recommended? Is there a silver lining in all of this?
Well, good question, Anubhav. Hope springs eternal. I think clearly that, as I've been saying, the coronavirus is going to supersede and in some ways subsume other BRI priorities, including the enhancement of the project management, whether it's in terms of labor or corruption or environment. Some of that is going to, frankly, go by the boards as both Beijing and the relevant governments swivel to focus on the challenge presented by coronavirus in the first instance. I think the coronavirus experience, this pandemic emergency, is a graphic demonstration of why it is critically important for wealthier countries like the United States, like China, not just to respond to a crisis, but to work together to build up global health security in other parts of the world, in the vulnerable parts of the world. I worked for President Obama for 8 years, and through the H1N1 crisis, the Ebola crisis, where the United States found a way to enable the participation of Chinese PLA and the Chinese doctors in West Africa. This is a point that Obama made over and over and over again, that we can't insulate ourselves by walls and borders from an infectious disease, and that it is infinitely in the interests of the industrialized world to try to build up the public health infrastructure in the developing world, because that lack of infrastructure contributes to our own vulnerability. And we may be seeing the boomerang effect recurrent of coronavirus in places like China that have largely contained it, if it takes hold in Africa and other parts of the world. So, Anubhav, to me, in a perfect world, China, as a matter of urgency, would forgive Belt and Road debt in low-income countries, so that money, which is a lot of money, could then be reprogrammed to fund health-related services and facilities. And even better than that, I think this is the moment when the United States and China ought to be working together, maybe collaborating on that health Silk Road in a way that creates resilience in the developing world and that prevents perhaps the next pandemic. That said, it's pretty hard to see this taking place, first of all, amid a global recession. Second of all, given the appalling state of US-China relations. And frankly, it's pretty hard to see the leaders of either of the two countries stepping up to that plate. But it, in my mind, unquestionably is what ought to happen.
Great. Well, we have a few questions coming in from YouTube and Facebook, so why don't I turn to those now. The first is from Nicole Bennett Feet. I apologize if I am pronouncing that incorrectly. Her question is about Iran, which has been one of the countries that has suffered quite a bit because of the coronavirus epidemic. She asks, can you speak to the historic relationship between China and Iran as it pertains to the BRI, and how has coronavirus impacted that?
Well, Iran, Persia, and China are arguably, two ends of the Silk Road. So there is historic and psychological relevance. There's also political relevance. China has been careful not to get crosswise with international community with respect to Iran's nuclear program and so on. But at the same time, as a charter member of the 6+1, the countries that negotiated with Iran the nuclear deal, China also has invested heavily in a constructive way forward with Iran that would address the risks posed by Iran of instability in the region from a nuclear program, but would also enfranchise Iran and allow Iran to participate in the global affairs, particularly allow Iran to sell oil, because China buys and is dependent on Iranian-produced oil. Now, I haven't charted the flow of the virus, although there is a big and important spread on various pathways in Thursday's New York Times. But there is abundant reason to believe that the initial outbreaks in Iran were inadvertently imported along with Chinese tourists and visitors, and that's true many other places as well. I think that the Chinese government has, for Iran as well, extended an offer of medical material and assistance. But at the same time, in the initial stages when the outbreak spiked in Iran, I think that China, certainly some in the propaganda department, were not above using that as a way of deflecting from China's own missteps early on in Wuhan, by way of suggesting that, hey, look, it's not just us. Other countries are falling victim to this virus as well.
Great. And you mentioned the need for international cooperation at this moment, especially between the U.S. and China, and making sure the crisis doesn't get worse. And we have a couple of questions on YouTube that are really essentially about this. We have a question from Donald Camp, who's a friend and colleague, formerly also from formerly of the State Department. So Donald Camp asks, is there a way forward for improved U.S.-China relations in a post-coronavirus future that will allow us to cooperate in global economic development, if not in the South China Sea?
Hey, Don. Thanks for the question. There absolutely is, and there has to be a path for U.S.-China cooperation. And you know what? We've done it before. It's not entirely a mystery. Now, undoubtedly, U.S.-China cooperation in 2021 and beyond is going to look different than the various experiments in cooperation that have preceded it, for a number of reasons. China has changed, the U.S. has changed, the world has changed. But the need for active cooperation, collaboration, synchronization between the two major economies, the two strongest countries on the planet, it has not changed. So one place, as I've suggested to begin, is where we are, which is in a ferocious battle with a very dangerous and highly infectious virus. So there's no excuse for the US government, the Chinese government, to waste time in recriminations and finger pointing, playing the geopolitical equivalent of ping pong in a blame game. No, both the governments, their respective CDCs, the various health-related ministries like the FDA and so on, along with labs, government and private, along with companies, should be exchanging information freely. Collaborative research should be encouraged, not punished. We should concentrate in the first instance on dealing with the virus itself. That means developing and clinically testing vaccines and antivirals and so on. We should concentrate also on building up global health infrastructure, no question about it. We should reconnect our supply chains to the extent that China can provide material, medical items, and so on that are just inexplicably in such short supply in the United States and, of course, in other priority needs countries. I made a blue sky suggestion about broader collaboration, sustained collaboration in public health. But there are many other things. Our colleague, Wendy Kotler, has recommended that both sides scale back, if not withdraw, their respective tariffs and export controls on medical items between the US and China and elsewhere. And all countries should. This should be something that the US champions in international fora. There's also plenty of space for the United States and China to cooperate in multilateral settings, the global health security agenda, for example, and beyond. Collaboration both on the medical side, but also, as seems belatedly to be starting with the G20, collaboration on the economic side as well.
Great. Another question here from YouTube, suggesting that last year at the second Belt and Road Forum, President Xi encouraged international multilateral and private investors to invest in BRI projects. Now that we're likely facing a global recession, do you see that going anywhere? And what has been the involvement of multinational companies and foreign investors in the BRI so far?
Great question. Thank you. The track record for China's effort to entice multilateral development banks or private commercial banks, sovereign governments or private companies to invest in Belt and Road projects has been close to terrible, has been absolutely minimal. And there's a fairly simple reason for it, which is that one of the things that my colleague and I found in our research on BRI projects is that there has been very, very little risk assessment. Now, you could argue, as many of the officials responsible for infrastructure and development in the low-income countries that we visited argued, that the World Bank and the IMF have gone to the other extreme, that they're sort of too demanding, that the hurdles are too high, and therefore projects can't go forward. But you're simply not going to get, a private equity bank or a commercial bank to put money into a project if it hasn't been adequately de-risked. What are the political risks? What are the environmental risks? What are the legal and financial issues and risks? Is this project actually going to pay for itself? Is it going to make money? What are the guarantees and so on? If those questions can't be adequately answered, let alone if there is a steep overhang of corrupt practices that skew bidding, lack of transparency so that contracts are handed out without a competitive process, you're just not going to get private money to weigh in. And in fact, the Chinese government had found it quite difficult even to get Chinese private investors to put money in. The AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the brainchild of the Chinese themselves, has yet to throw its resources behind Belt and Road projects because lo and behold, it has pretty rigorous standards for evaluating risk and for evaluating the projects that it will pay into. So, this is not to say that there aren't specific individual projects that have private investors, particularly in the host country, participating. But the kind of large-scale investment that Chinese President Xi Jinping was calling for in the second Belt and Road Forum was not forthcoming in economic boom times. It seems to me that it's therefore unlikely to materialize in the midst of a global recession.
Great. So I have I'll take one final question from Facebook. This is from Ricardo from London. He asks, can you comment on China's presence in the Atlantic Ocean? Is China's funding into the Special Maritime Economic Zone in the Cape Verde Islands part of the BRI? But perhaps let's talk about overall, does this crisis mean that China's going to have to severely roll back some of the ambitions for the initiative in the medium and long term?
It's not my impression that the Atlantic Ocean per se is at the top of Chinese strategists and policymakers' agenda. In the first instance, China is profoundly focused on the so-called first island chain, on its near seas, on South China Sea, the East China Sea. Beyond that, China is deeply interested and focused on the rest of the Western Pacific, but importantly on the Indian Ocean and on the maritime pathways through which China obtains the lion's share of its energy and other resources. Now, I think as a general matter, Anubhav and Ricardo, what we're going to see is a difficult triage exercise by the Chinese leadership in apportioning resources among competing multiple priority budget items. Without a doubt, an important budget item is going to be continuing China's military modernization, funding the PLA. But is that going to come at the expense of putting in place the missing social safety nets, putting in place the health care and the other health-related services and systems that are clearly needed and that the Chinese people are going to be increasingly demanding in the wake of the coronavirus? And how is that going to stack up against important initiatives such as what we've been discussing, the Belt and Road, which I have, to put it starkly, been hemorrhaging public money that are sort of conceived in the heyday of China's seemingly limitless treasury and its immense reserves of foreign capital. I think that the Chinese leadership will have some difficult choices ahead, but I do not think that it's military, that the PLA that operates increasingly in all of the world's oceans, including, importantly, in the Arctic Ocean. I don't think that the People's Liberation Army is going to find that the funding stream gets cut off by the Chinese Communist Party. It's very unlikely, in my opinion.
Thank you, Danny. That's a lot to mull over for both Chinese policymakers as well as host countries around Asia and beyond. With that, we're going to bring this discussion to a close. I'm grateful to you, Danny, for providing such an insightful policy picture about the current state of the BRI and your predictions for its fate going forward. And I want to thank all of our viewers for watching and sending questions. This discussion will be posted on the Asia Society Policy Institute and Asia Society Facebook accounts, as well as on YouTube and the Asia Society website. We have additional events in the Asia Society Policy Institute series coming up, as well as a host of upcoming events organized by Asia Society that will be streamed online. Please join us in the coming days and weeks. Just tomorrow, Friday, March 27th at 8:30 a.m. New York time, there's an Asia Society web discussion entitled Lessons Learned, Flattening the Curve in Korea, about South Korea's public health response. For ASPI's additional coronavirus programming and analysis, and for information about future events in this series, like us on Facebook, and you can also follow us on Twitter @Asia Policy. This has been a pleasure. I hope all of you are following the guidelines of your local health and government officials while assisting your family, friends, and your wider communities. Remember, we are all in this together. Thank you, Danny, once again. And this is Anubhav Gupta from the Asia Society Policy Institute.
Thanks, Anubhav. Thanks, everybody.